I'm walking through the Reformation series that Desiring God put together to give you a fuller history of Christianity. Join me.
Let's talk about Thomas Cranmer. When you hear that name, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, he's a hero of the faith, maybe even a martyr, who completely reshaped Christianity in England. But was he really a pious saint, driven by some kind of divine mission? Or was he a sharp political operator, just trying to survive the absolute chaos of the Tudor court? All right, let's get into it and see if we can unpack the man behind the legend.
So the popular story, the one we all kind of know, is pretty epic. Cranmer is painted as the master architect of the English Reformation. He's the guy who championed the whole idea of justification by faith alone, who finally broke England away from Rome and brought in the true gospel, and, of course, the story ends with him dying a martyr's death for everything he believed in. That's the hero, right? That's the figure we read about.
You know, as compelling as that story is, you have to ask, is it the whole story? What if the reality is way more complicated and maybe a little less heroic? What if the legend we know is more myth than actual history?
To figure that out, we've got to go right back to the beginning. And what we find is pretty provocative. The idea that the English Reformation didn't start with a crisis of faith, but actually with a crisis of politics.
So you've got these two totally different narratives. On one side, there's this popular idea of a huge spiritual awakening, this wave of new theological convictions sweeping the nation. But when you look at the historical context, you see something else entirely. It looks more like a top-down, state-driven act that was born out of a very messy political and, honestly, dynastic crisis.
And here's the real kicker. The initial break from Rome had almost nothing to do with doctrine. The actual catalyst, the thing that set it all in motion, was King Henry VIII's desperate obsession with getting a male heir, and, to do that, getting an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. It was a political problem that needed a religious excuse.
And the sequence of events here tells you everything you need to know. Just look at the dates. The political drama kicks off in 1527, with Henry wanting that annulment. By 1534, England has politically severed ties with Rome. It's only after all of that happens, after the political break is a done deal, that Cranmer's own Reformed theology really starts to take shape. The politics literally paved the way for the piety.
Okay, so let's move on and see how this intense political landscape actually shaped Cranmer himself. We're going to trace his theological journey, and trust me, it was not a straight line.
You know, this idea that Cranmer had some kind of lightning bolt conversion to Protestantism, it just doesn't hold up. His journey was hesitant, it was uneven, and it was constantly being shaped by the incredibly dangerous political winds of the day. His beliefs shifted, he compromised, all while trying to balance his loyalty to a very unpredictable king with his own developing ideas about faith. And this gets to the absolute core of a massive theological change. So you see Cranmer in 1547 saying, "Faith only justifieth us." Simple enough. But then you look at someone like Irenaeus, a huge figure in the early church, writing over 1,000 years earlier. He taught that we are justified through faith and works. That's a critical difference. Cranmer's theology created a split between the two, while for the ancient church, faith and action were basically two sides of the same coin, completely inseparable.
So, if the actual history is this messy and complicated, how on earth did we end up with this simple, clean hero story? Well, that brings us right to our next section. We need to understand the anatomy of a hero myth.
You see, these powerful narratives are built using some classic tools. First, you've got the heroic reformer trope, the one lone genius fighting against a corrupt system. Then you add the gospel recovered motif, this idea that the truth was totally lost for centuries and had to be found again. And finally, you have the powerful martyrdom frame, which takes his execution, a really complex political and religious event, and makes it look just like the noble sacrifices of the early Christians. Put them all together, and you get a very compelling but very simplified story.
And this quote right here just nails it. A lot of popular portrayals, especially from some modern ministries, really romanticize the English Reformation. They frame it as this purely spiritual liberation, and in doing so, they kind of gloss over the messy, uncomfortable, and deeply political reality that was actually driving the whole thing.
So that leads us to our final section, where we're going to try to piece together a more complete, more honest picture of Cranmer's really complicated legacy. It's time to move beyond that simple story.
So, what was the end result of all this upheaval? Well, the English Reformation wasn't really a return to some purer, ancient version of Christianity. It was an innovation. It created something new, a national church, where religious faith became fundamentally tangled up with and filtered through the power of the state. And that really is the biggest takeaway. Cranmer's story isn't about finding an old faith that had been lost. It's about the birth of something completely new, a nationalized form of Christianity that would go on to shape England and really the entire world for centuries. All of which leaves us with one last, really big question to think about. Looking at Thomas Cranmer, or really any major historical figure, we have to ask ourselves, when does the messy, complex reality of history get polished and smoothed into a simple story, and maybe even more important, who gets to decide which version of that story we all get to hear?